The courtroom echoed with laughter. Judge Robert Whitmore leaned back in his chair, shaking his head, a smirk spreading across his wrinkled face. You? Representing yourself. He let out another chuckle. Son, do you even know what a motion to dismiss is? The spectators joined in, their laughter rolling through the wood-paneled room like a wave. Some shook their heads, whispering to one another. Even the opposing lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Mitchell Graves, chuckled under his breath. But the man standing in the defendant's chair didn't laugh. Jeremiah King, a tall black man in his late 30s, simply adjusted his tie. His deep brown eyes scanned the room, taking in every snicker, every judgmental stare. He had seen that look before: doubt, arrogance, mockery. But none of that mattered. He smiled. Then, in a calm and steady voice, he said words that would make everyone's laughter die in their throats. Your Honor, he began, before you embarrass yourself further, allow me to explain why this entire case is built on a lie, and why, in precisely 5 minutes, I will have you considering an immediate dismissal. The courtroom went silent. Judge Whitmore straightened up, his expression tightening. The laughter stopped. Even Mitchell Graves looked uneasy. No one was laughing anymore. 3 months earlier, Jeremiah King walked through the busy streets of Atlanta, his worn leather briefcase swinging at his side. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't even someone people would expect to set foot in a courtroom. Most of his life had been spent in places far different from a judge's chambers: construction sites, factory floors, and, at one point, even a prison cell. But he had something more powerful than a degree. He had knowledge. Years ago, while serving a wrongful sentence, Jeremiah had spent every waking hour reading law books. He studied cases, memorized precedents, and learned the system inside and out. He realized something crucial: justice wasn't about truth. It was about who understood the rules best. And now, he needed that knowledge more than ever. The notice had come in the mail a week ago. A lawsuit. A powerful real estate firm, Glendale & Sons, was suing him over a property he inherited from his late father. They claimed the deed had issues, that it wasn't legally his. But Jeremiah knew better. The problem? No lawyer wanted to take his case. Too risky, they said. Too complicated. Just sell the property and walk away. But Jeremiah refused. That house wasn't just a house. It was his father's legacy, and he wasn't going to let some greedy corporation steal it. So he made a decision. He would fight them himself. The day of the trial, Jeremiah walked into the courtroom wearing a suit that wasn't new but was clean and pressed. He clutched a folder filled with notes. He knew what he was up against. Glendale & Sons had hired one of the best attorneys in the state. Mitchell Graves was a man with a perfect record, a master at twisting words and making the innocent look guilty. Still, Jeremiah wasn't afraid. The judge entered, and the trial began. Mitchell Graves wasted no time. Your Honor, this man has no legal experience, Graves said smoothly. This case is a waste of time. I motion to dismiss it immediately. Judge Whitmore nodded, barely glancing at Jeremiah. That seems reasonable. Mr. King, unless you have an actual legal argument, Jeremiah raised a hand. Your Honor, with all due respect, if you allow him to dismiss this case without reviewing the evidence, you'll be violating federal law. Whitmore frowned. Excuse me. Jeremiah calmly flipped open his folder. According to the 1978 Supreme Court ruling in Thompson v. Fairbanks, a property owner cannot be evicted or have their deed challenged without concrete proof of fraudulent acquisition. Glendale & Sons have provided no such proof. Silence. Mitchell Graves' face stiffened. The judge leaned forward, suddenly interested. Jeremiah continued. Furthermore, under the Property Rights Act, Section 18B, I am entitled to full due process before any decision is made. A motion to dismiss without review would not only be unethical, it would be illegal. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Whitmore adjusted his glasses. Mr. King, his voice was lower now, more cautious. Are you a lawyer? Jeremiah smiled slightly. No, Your Honor. The judge studied him, the laughter from before completely gone. Something flickered in his eyes, something Jeremiah had seen before. Doubt. Doubt that this so-called nobody standing before him was actually far more dangerous than he had assumed. Before Whitmore could respond, Mitchell Graves slammed his hands on the table. Objection. Your Honor, this man is not qualified to interpret law. Jeremiah turned to him, still calm. Mr. Graves, Are you suggesting that a man must hold a law degree to understand the law? Because if so, that contradicts the entire basis of the judicial system, where laws are meant to be understood by the people. Another murmur. Judge Whitmore narrowed his eyes. Then, before anyone could say another word, the door to the courtroom burst open. A police officer rushed in, his face pale. He whispered something into the judge's ear. Whatever it was, it made Whitmore's eyes widen in shock. And just like that, the entire trial took a turn no one could have predicted. Judge Whitmore's face turned pale as the police officer whispered in his ear. Whatever was said, it made the confident, smirking judge stiffen in his seat. The entire courtroom watched in silence. Jeremiah King didn't move. He could feel the weight of the moment. Something had just shifted, but he had no idea what. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat, his demeanor suddenly different. The arrogance, the mockery, it was gone. "We will take a short recess," he announced abruptly, his voice tight. 15 minutes. The gavel struck wood. The spectators murmured. People looked at each other, wondering what was going on. Jeremiah remained seated, calm as ever. But inside, his mind was racing. Mitchell Graves shot him a look, a mix of confusion and irritation, before storming toward the judge's chambers. Something wasn't right, and Jeremiah intended to find out exactly what it was. 3 weeks earlier, Jeremiah stood outside the house his father had left him, gripping the railing of the front porch. The home wasn't fancy. It had peeling white paint and a few broken steps, but it was filled with memories. He had grown up here. His father, Samuel King, had built this house with his own hands. And now, someone wanted to take it from him. A sleek black Mercedes pulled up in front of the house. A tall, sharp-featured man stepped out. He wore a gray suit, his hair slicked back. Jeremiah recognized him immediately. Matthew Glendale, the owner of Glendale and Sons. Jeremiah crossed his arms. "Didn't expect to see you here in person." Glendale smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. King, I like to handle business matters directly." Jeremiah said nothing. Glendale adjusted his cufflinks. "Listen, I understand how you must feel. This house, it means something to you. But business is business. That deed of yours has complications. It's not worth the fight." "Complications?" Jeremiah repeated, his tone calm but firm. Glendale gave a small shrug. "An old clerical error. It happens. Nothing personal." Jeremiah narrowed his eyes. "If it's nothing personal, then why are you going out of your way to steal it?" Glendale sighed. "I'm offering you a deal. Take the settlement money. It's more than fair." Jeremiah looked at the check Glendale held out. A lot of money. Enough to start over somewhere else. But money wasn't the issue. He stared at Glendale, his voice steady. "No." Glendale's smile tightened. "That's disappointing." He slid the check back into his pocket. "You seem like a smart man, Mr. King. But let me give you some advice. Court isn't kind to men like you. Especially ones without lawyers." Jeremiah tilted his head. "We'll see." Glendale stepped back toward his car. "Have it your way. But don't say I didn't warn you." The car pulled away, leaving Jeremiah standing on the porch. He wasn't scared, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about the house. It was about something bigger, and he was going to find out what. Back in the courtroom, the recess ended. Jeremiah sat in his seat as Judge Whitmore returned, looking more composed but noticeably uneasy. The police officer who had whispered to him earlier was gone. Mitchell Graves had a tight look on his face, as if he had just received bad news. Judge Whitmore adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Let's proceed." Jeremiah leaned forward. "Your Honor, before we continue, I'd like to request full disclosure regarding any external influence on this case." Whitmore blinked. "Excuse me." Jeremiah held his ground. "Something has changed in the last 15 minutes. I believe the court has the right to know what it is." The room was silent. Graves stood up, forcing a chuckle. "Objection. This is nonsense." Jeremiah turned to him. "Then why do you look nervous?" Graves' jaw tightened. Judge Whitmore sighed. "Mr. King, this court does not operate on speculation. Do you have a legal basis for this request?" Jeremiah pulled out another document. "Actually, I do. Under the Judicial Conduct Code, Section 12A, any external influence on a judge that may alter the fairness of a case must be disclosed to both parties." The courtroom stirred. Mitchell Graves exhaled sharply, looking at the judge. "Your Honor, he's grasping at straws." But Whitmore didn't respond right away. He glanced down at his desk, his fingers twitching slightly. Then, he did something no one expected. He sighed. And then he said, "Motion granted." The courtroom gasped. Mitchell Graves snapped his head toward him. "Your Honor." Judge Whitmore raised a hand, silencing him. He looked directly at Jeremiah. "Mr. King, you may not be a lawyer, but you certainly know how to make one sweat." And with that, he picked up his gavel and slammed it down. The gavel struck like a thunderclap. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. This wasn't normal. A judge didn't just grant a motion like that, especially not to a man representing himself. Something was happening beneath the surface, something bigger than just a lawsuit over a house. Jeremiah King sat still, his face calm, but inside, his mind was racing. What had that officer whispered to the judge? Why had Whitmore gone from mocking him to suddenly playing by the book? And why did Mitchell Graves look like someone had just stolen his ace card? Judge Whitmore adjusted his robe, exhaling through his nose. "This court is in session," he said, his voice low and measured. He turned toward Jeremiah. "Mr. King, you've made a serious allegation, suggesting there may be external influence on this case. You've invoked Section 12A of the Judicial Conduct Code, which requires transparency in such matters." Jeremiah nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Whitmore hesitated, his fingers tapping against the desk. Then he turned to the court clerk. "Bring in Officer Daniels." A few murmurs rippled through the spectators. Mitchell Graves shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." Whitmore's eyes cut to him, sharp as a blade. "Sit down, Mr. Graves." Graves clenched his jaw but obeyed. A moment later, the courtroom doors opened, and Officer Daniels walked in. He was the same officer who had whispered in Whitmore's ear earlier. A tall, stocky man with graying hair. Daniels approached the witness stand, his expression unreadable. Whitmore adjusted his glasses. "Officer Daniels, state for the record what you told me during the recess." Daniels hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Graves. Then, he swallowed hard and spoke. "Your Honor, I received an anonymous tip about a conflict of interest in this case." The room fell silent. Jeremiah's pulse quickened. Whitmore frowned. "What kind of conflict?" Daniels exhaled. "Evidence suggesting that Glendale and Sons made financial contributions to individuals with influence over legal proceedings, including officials who oversee property disputes." A ripple of gasps spread through the spectators. Jeremiah's mind clicked. That was it. That was why Glendale and Sons had been so sure they could take his house. It wasn't just about legal technicalities. They had people in their pockets. Whitmore's face darkened. He turned toward Mitchell Graves. "Mr. Graves, do you have any knowledge of this?" Graves forced a laugh, but it was weak. "Your Honor, this is absurd. An anonymous tip? That's hardly evidence." Jeremiah leaned forward. "Maybe not, but I have evidence." Every head turned toward him. Graves' face drained of color. "What?" Jeremiah opened his folder, pulling out several sheets of paper. "During my own research, I found multiple property cases handled by Glendale and Sons where the opposing party mysteriously lost, even when they had strong legal claims. And in every single one, there was a financial transaction recorded shortly before the case ended." He held up one page in particular. "This is a copy of a wire transfer, $50,000, from Glendale and Sons to an unknown account just a week before my case was scheduled." The room erupted in noise. Judge Whitmore's face turned cold. He grabbed the paper from the bailiff, scanning it with narrowed eyes. Then, for the first time, he looked shaken. Graves shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is circumstantial at best." "He's grasping at." Whitmore slammed his gavel. "Enough." The room went silent again. Jeremiah stared at Mitchell Graves, and for the first time, the attorney wasn't smirking. He was sweating. And Jeremiah knew why. Because the tides had just turned. For years earlier, Jeremiah sat on a prison cot, a thick book in his lap. The small, dimly lit cell smelled of old concrete and stale air. He wasn't supposed to be here. Wrong place, wrong time. That's what they called it. A minor altercation at a gas station had turned into a nightmare. The police report had been twisted, witnesses had changed their stories, and before he knew it, he was standing before a judge who barely looked at him before passing down a guilty verdict. That was the day he realized something. The law wasn't about justice. It was about who understood the game. So he learned the game. Every day, he sat in the prison library, devouring legal books. He memorized case law, dissected trial transcripts, and studied the exact rules that had been used against him. And slowly, he started to see the cracks in the system. He started to see how people like Glendale and Sons could manipulate it. And he promised himself that if he ever got out, he wouldn't just survive. He'd fight back. Back in the courtroom, Judge Whitmore tapped his fingers against the bench, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "Mr. King," he said slowly, "are you suggesting that Glendale and Sons have engaged in judicial bribery?" Jeremiah met his gaze. "I'm not suggesting it. I'm proving it." Another ripple of gasps. Graves turned to him, his voice low and dangerous. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mr. King." Jeremiah smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "So are you." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Judge Whitmore let out a long breath. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he lifted his gavel. "Due to the nature of these allegations," he said, "this court is placing an immediate hold on all proceedings until further investigation." Graves stiffened. "Your Honor, this is highly." Whitmore's gaze snapped to him. "Say another word, and you'll be in contempt." Graves swallowed hard. Jeremiah sat back, exhaling slowly. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. But for the first time since this battle began, he knew he was winning. And then, the back doors to the courtroom burst open. A man in a dark suit stormed inside, flanked by two others. He walked straight to the front of the room, bypassing security like he owned the place. Jeremiah didn't recognize him, but the look on Mitchell Graves' face told him everything. Whoever this man was, he was the one pulling the strings. And now he was here. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind the man in the dark suit. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked hair and a presence that made people shrink away. His navy blue suit was perfectly pressed, his black leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. He carried himself like someone who was used to being in control. Jeremiah could see it instantly. This wasn't just another corporate lawyer. This was someone with real power. The man walked straight past the spectators, past the prosecution table, and stopped in front of Judge Whitmore's bench. He didn't even glance at Jeremiah. Instead, he placed a small folder on the judge's desk and leaned in slightly. "We need to speak. Now." His voice was smooth, calm, but laced with authority. Judge Whitmore stiffened. His eyes flickered to Mitchell Graves, who looked like he'd just seen a ghost. Jeremiah folded his arms, watching carefully. "Excuse me," Jeremiah said, his voice breaking through the tension. "Who exactly are you?" The man turned toward him for the first time, his steel-gray eyes locking onto Jeremiah's. For a second, he didn't speak. He just studied him. Then, in a voice that carried through the entire courtroom, he said, "I'm Richard Langston." A hush fell over the room. Jeremiah didn't recognize the name, but judging by the way everyone else reacted, he was someone important. Judge Whitmore straightened in his seat. "Mr. Langston," he said cautiously, "this is a public trial. If you wish to be heard, you'll need to make a formal." Langston held up a hand. "This matter doesn't belong in a public forum, Your Honor." His gaze swept the room. "There are details in this case that should not be discussed in open court." Jeremiah narrowed his eyes. "And why is that?" Langston turned back to him, his expression unreadable. "Because, Mr. King, you're getting involved in something much larger than you understand." Jeremiah didn't flinch. "Try me." Langston's lips twitched slightly, almost like he was amused. Then, he looked back at the judge. "A private meeting." Now, Judge Whitmore hesitated, glancing between Langston and Jeremiah. The entire courtroom was watching, waiting. Then, Whitmore let out a slow breath. "Court is in recess," he announced. "Mr. King, Mr. Graves, Mr. Langston, my chambers." Now, the gavel struck. People immediately erupted in whispers, but security moved in, clearing the room. Jeremiah could feel the weight of eyes on him as he stood, adjusting his tie. Whatever was about to happen, it wasn't just about his case anymore. 15 minutes later, Jeremiah sat in the judge's private chambers, facing Richard Langston across a polished oak table. Judge Whitmore sat at his desk, arms crossed. Mitchell Graves sat stiffly in his chair, his jaw clenched. Langston looked completely at ease. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and leaned back slightly, his gray eyes fixed on Jeremiah. "You're a stubborn man, Mr. King." Jeremiah smirked. "I've been called worse." Langston chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Do you have any idea what you've stepped into?" Jeremiah folded his arms. "A corrupt real estate company trying to steal my father's house." "Yeah, I think I've got a pretty good idea." Langston sighed. It's bigger than that. Jeremiah said nothing, waiting. Langston leaned forward. Glendale and Sons isn't just a real estate firm. It's a front. Jeremiah frowned. A front for what? Langston hesitated, then reached into his suit pocket. He pulled out a small USB drive and slid it across the table. Take a look. Jeremiah picked it up, turning it between his fingers. What's on this? Proof, Langston said. Proof that this case isn't just about your father's house. It's about a systematic operation, one that involves forged property records, rigged court cases, and payoffs that go far beyond this courtroom. Jeremiah felt his pulse quicken. He had suspected corruption, but this was on another level. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat. Mr. Langston, why exactly are you telling us this now? If you've had this information all along. Because, Langston cut in smoothly. I was hoping this case would go unnoticed. That Mr. King would take the settlement, and this would all disappear. Jeremiah's eyes darkened. So you're admitting you wanted me to lose? Langston tilted his head. Not exactly. I wanted this case buried before it reached the public. But now it's too late for that. Mitchell Graves finally spoke, his voice tight. This is insane. You can't just. Langston turned to him, his voice suddenly sharp. Shut up, Graves. Graves' mouth snapped shut. Jeremiah's mind was racing. If what Langston was saying was true, this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about hundreds, maybe thousands, of people who had been cheated out of their homes and land. Jeremiah looked at Langston. Why are you telling me this? Langston sighed. Because I underestimated you, Mr. King. I thought you were just another desperate man trying to fight a losing battle. He gestured toward the USB. But you proved me wrong. Jeremiah raised an eyebrow. And Langston leaned forward, his expression unreadable. And now I need to decide whether you're a problem or an opportunity. The room went silent. Jeremiah studied Langston carefully. He could feel the weight of the moment, the shifting power, the hidden agendas. And then, just as he was about to respond, a loud bang erupted from outside the judge's chambers. The door flew open. A security officer rushed in, his face pale. Judge Whitmore. Someone just broke into the court archives. Whitmore shot to his feet. What? The officer nodded, breathing hard. Files were stolen. Cases involving Glendale and Sons. The security footage was wiped. Jeremiah felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. Someone was trying to erase the evidence. And that meant one thing. They knew the truth was about to come out. Jeremiah's heart pounded. A break-in? Someone had just stolen court files. Files that could be connected to his case. Judge Whitmore's face darkened as he grabbed his coat. Show me. He barked at the security officer, already heading for the door. Richard Langston stood slowly, adjusting his suit cuffs. He didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked annoyed, like he had expected something like this to happen. Jeremiah glanced at him, his suspicion growing. Mitchell Graves was already backing toward the door, his face pale. He looked like he wanted to disappear. Jeremiah stood up, slipping the USB drive into his pocket before following the others out of the judge's chambers. This wasn't over. Not even close. Minutes later, they arrived at the courthouse records office. The door had been forced open, the lock shattered. Inside, cabinets had been ripped open, papers strewn across the floor. The smell of printer ink and old paper filled the air. A security guard stood there, looking shaken. We came as soon as we heard the alarm, but, he swallowed hard. They were fast. They knew exactly what they were looking for. Jeremiah walked into the room, scanning the wreckage. His eyes landed on an empty shelf with a label that made his stomach tighten. Property disputes, Glendale and Sons. Of course, someone had erased the paper trail. Judge Whitmore ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. This is not a coincidence. He turned to the security guard. Do we have security footage? The guard hesitated. That's the thing, sir. The system was hacked. The files are gone. Of course they are, Jeremiah muttered. Langston stepped forward, studying the mess. He sighed. Well, Mr. King, he said smoothly. It seems your case has attracted the wrong kind of attention. Jeremiah turned to him. Seems like you know exactly who's behind this. Langston didn't confirm or deny. He simply slipped his hands into his pockets. I know powerful people, Mr. King. And when powerful people get desperate, they make mistakes. Jeremiah narrowed his eyes. Are you desperate, Mr. Langston? Langston's lips twitched slightly. Not yet. The tension between them was thick, unspoken words hanging in the air. Jeremiah clenched his fists. They had just destroyed key evidence, but they hadn't destroyed everything. Because Jeremiah still had the USB drive. And if Langston was telling the truth, then that little device in his pocket might be the only thing keeping the case alive. 2 hours later, Jeremiah sat in his apartment, staring at his laptop. The USB drive lay on the table, untouched. He exhaled slowly. This was it. The moment he plugged this in, there was no turning back. For a brief second, he thought about walking away, about taking the easy route, forgetting about this whole thing, and moving on with his life. But then he remembered his father. He remembered the look in Samuel King's eyes when he used to sit on their porch, watching the sunset, telling stories about how he built their house from the ground up. "This is ours, son," he had said one night. "They can't take it. Not as long as you fight for it." Jeremiah clenched his jaw. He inserted the USB drive. A folder popped up. Confidential. He clicked it. Dozens of files appeared. Names, addresses, transactions. But one file caught his eye. A single document, labeled Judicial Payouts, classified. He clicked it, and what he saw made his blood run cold. It was a list. A long one. Names of judges, politicians, high-ranking court officials. And next to each name, a dollar amount. Jeremiah's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just corruption. This was a full-scale operation. Glendale and Sons wasn't just stealing properties. They were buying the system itself. And then, his phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "Stop looking, or you won't like what happens next." Jeremiah stared at the message, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. Then, before he could even react, a loud crash came from outside. Someone was at his door, and they weren't knocking. Jeremiah's heart pounded in his chest as he sat frozen on his couch. The harsh buzz of his phone had barely faded when a loud crash came from the front door. It was not a knock or a soft tap. It was a forceful, terrifying smash. Jeremiah's eyes flew open. The sound echoed in his small apartment, shaking the walls. For a moment, he lay still, too shocked to move. Then his instincts kicked in. He bolted to the window and peeked out through the curtains. Outside, the street was dark and empty, the faint light of a street lamp barely revealing a shadow standing near his door. The figure moved slowly, almost as if it were testing the air for danger. Jeremiah's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. He reached for his phone, his hand trembling, and dialed 911. But before the call could go through, the door burst open once again, and a tall man in dark clothing stepped into the hall. His face was hidden by a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. The intruder's presence filled the room with a cold, heavy fear. "Jeremiah King?" the man asked in a low voice. His tone was calm, yet every word sent shivers down Jeremiah's spine. "Who are you? What do you want?" Jeremiah managed to ask, his voice shaky. He edged backwards, his eyes never leaving the stranger. The man did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around the modest apartment. After a moment, he stepped forward and pulled out a small envelope from his jacket. "I have a message for you," he said quietly, placing the envelope on the coffee table before disappearing as quickly as he had come. Jeremiah stood alone in the silent apartment. Slowly, he picked up the envelope with trembling fingers and opened it. Inside was a neatly folded piece of paper. The message, written in simple block letters, read, "Stop looking, or else." A chill ran down his spine. Jeremiah's thoughts raced. He knew that his discovery of the USB drive and the evidence on it had upset some very powerful people. Now, someone had come to warn him. But the warning was not friendly. It was a threat. He sat down on his worn-out couch and stared at the note for several long moments. The words seemed to vibrate on the paper, each letter filled with menace. Yet even as fear curled in his stomach, a spark of determination grew in him. He remembered his father's words about never giving up, no matter how hard the battle became. Taking a deep breath, Jeremiah made a decision. He would not be frightened into silence. He had come too far, and the truth about corruption was too important to hide. He picked up the USB drive again and looked at it as if it were a key to his future. The evidence it held could not be destroyed by a simple threat. Jeremiah decided to secure his apartment first. He checked the locks on the door and windows, closing them tightly, as if he could keep the danger at bay with mere metal and wood. His hands shook as he fastened a heavy curtain across the door, hoping that the intruder would not return so soon. Later that night, after the police had been called and a patrol car had passed by the block, Jeremiah sat at his small kitchen table with a cup of cold tea. The house was quiet now, and the sound of his own heartbeat filled the silence. He tried to think of his next steps. The USB drive, the evidence of bribery and corruption, was still in his possession. But now he had to decide how to use it. He recalled his earlier meeting with Richard Langston in the judge's chambers. Langston had given him the USB drive as proof that the corruption ran deep, not only in Glendale and Sons, but also within the judicial system. That meeting had left Jeremiah with many questions. Who was Langston really? What was his true aim in showing him the evidence? And now, with the break-in at the court archives and the theft of files, it was clear that someone was working hard to bury the truth. Jeremiah remembered the painful lesson from his past, that sometimes, to fight a big and dangerous enemy, you must take risks. His father had built their home with his own 2 hands, and it was not just a building. It was a symbol of their family's honor and hard work. Losing it would mean losing a part of themselves. He had already taken on a fight that seemed bigger than any one man. Now, with this threat at his doorstep, the battle was taking on a new, even more dangerous shape. The next day dawned gray and overcast. Jeremiah decided to meet with his only friend who understood his struggle, his childhood friend Thomas, a kind man who worked as a paralegal in a local law office. Thomas was a quiet soul with a gentle smile and a belief in fairness and truth. Jeremiah had not told him everything about the case, but today he felt that he must share the heavy burden with someone who cared. At a small diner on the corner of a busy street in Atlanta, Jeremiah and Thomas sat in a quiet booth by the window. The aroma of coffee and freshly baked bread filled the air, but neither man paid much attention to the comforting smells. They were deep in conversation. "Thomas, I need your help," Jeremiah began, his voice low. "Things are getting worse than I thought." Thomas frowned, his eyes meeting Jeremiah's. "What do you mean, Jeremiah? Tell me everything." Jeremiah unfolded the note he had received and slid it across the table. "I got this last night, and the files were stolen from the court. I know this is connected to the case against Glendale and Sons. I have evidence that shows the corruption goes deep, but now someone is trying to scare me into silence." Thomas read the note carefully, his face growing more serious. "This is dangerous, Jeremiah. You have no idea who you're up against. You need to be very careful. This evidence, it could ruin lives." Jeremiah nodded. "I know, but I can't let them take what's rightfully mine. My father built that house with his sweat and tears. I have to fight, no matter what. I'm not going to let these people bully me into giving up." Thomas reached out and squeezed Jeremiah's hand. "Then we must find a way to protect you and the evidence. We need to get this information to someone trustworthy, someone who will expose the truth." They discussed their options quietly. Thomas suggested that they contact a well-known journalist who had a reputation for uncovering corruption. But Jeremiah was worried. The journalist might be targeted too. Instead, he proposed a plan to create copies of all the files on the USB drive and send them to multiple sources. That way, even if one copy was destroyed or tampered with, the truth would still be known. They spent the afternoon planning. Thomas took out his laptop and began writing a list of trusted contacts: a lawyer, a local news editor, and a representative from a public interest group. Jeremiah added details from his own research, including names and dates from the confidential files he had seen. They carefully discussed the best way to make copies and encrypt the information. As the sun began to set, the diner's lights glowed warmly against the coming darkness. For a while, the conversation turned from strategy to memories of better days. They spoke of childhood adventures, of running around the neighborhood, and of the dreams they once shared. This lighter moment gave Jeremiah a brief respite from the heavy burden on his shoulders. Yet, even as they talked, a feeling of urgency lingered. Jeremiah knew that every minute counted. The threat on his door, the break-in at the archives, and the message on his phone were signs that the people behind this conspiracy were growing bolder. The night was coming when the full force of their power would be unleashed. Later that evening, after parting ways with Thomas at the diner, Jeremiah returned to his apartment with a heavy heart and a mind full of plans. He set up a small workstation at his kitchen table and carefully connected his laptop to a portable hard drive. One by one, he began to copy the files from the USB drive. Each file took him back into a labyrinth of secrets, lists of names, large sums of money, and detailed transactions that linked the powerful figures in the court to illegal deals with Glendale and Sons. As the copying process continued, Jeremiah's thoughts wandered back to his father's gentle voice. Always stand up for what is right, no matter how hard it gets. That voice echoed in his mind, giving him strength in this dark hour. He resolved that he would honor that legacy, no matter the cost. The hours ticked by slowly. Outside his window, the city of Atlanta hummed quietly under the starry sky. In his small apartment, time seemed to stand still as he concentrated on securing the truth. But just when he thought he might have a moment of peace, a sound startled him. It was the low hum of footsteps in the hallway outside his apartment. Jeremiah's pulse quickened once more. He peered through the peephole and saw a shadow moving slowly along the corridor. The footsteps paused, and then a soft knock came at his door. This time, it was not a forceful crash, but a gentle, deliberate tapping. He took a deep breath and slowly moved to the door. Holding his breath, he looked through the peephole. Standing there was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. The man wore a simple sweater and had a calm presence that was very different from the men who had threatened him. "Who are you?" Jeremiah asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The man raised his hand in a friendly gesture. "My name is Daniel. I'm a friend of Thomas's. I heard about your situation and came to offer help. I promise, I mean you no harm." Jeremiah hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door a crack. Daniel stepped inside slowly, his eyes scanning the room with concern. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said softly, "but I want to make sure you are safe." Relief and suspicion mingled in Jeremiah's heart. Daniel's gentle demeanor was a stark contrast to the menacing threats he had faced. Yet, Jeremiah knew better than to trust anyone too quickly in times like these. "Thank you," he said cautiously. "I'm just trying to protect what's left of my family's honor." Daniel nodded understandingly. "I can help with that. I work in cybersecurity, and I can help you secure these files. We need to make sure that no one can come in and steal or change them again." Jeremiah's eyes lit up with hope. He had been so focused on copying and sharing the files that he had not thought about the possibility that someone could hack his system remotely. "That would be great," he said. "I'm afraid they will try to erase everything if they get another chance." Daniel set up his laptop and began checking the security settings of Jeremiah's computer. He explained in simple language what needed to be done, and soon they were both working together, carefully encrypting the files and setting up layers of protection. As they worked, the tension in the room eased just a little, replaced by a sense of determination and teamwork. They talked quietly about the situation, and Daniel revealed that he had seen similar threats before. "These kinds of criminals," he said softly, "they believe they are above the law. They use their power to silence anyone who dares to speak the truth. But every time, there is a spark, a person who stands up against them." Jeremiah felt that spark inside him. With Daniel's help, he strengthened the defenses on his computer and backed up the files to several secure cloud storage services. Slowly, he began to feel that his evidence was safe. But deep down, he knew that the danger was far from over. As midnight approached, the storm outside began to pick up. Rain pounded against the windows and the wind howled through the streets. The weather seemed to mirror the turmoil in Jeremiah's heart. Even as he worked, he could not shake the feeling that the night held one more surprise, a twist that would change everything. Just as Daniel finished setting up the final layer of encryption, the lights in the apartment flickered and went out. For a long, tense moment, the room was swallowed by darkness, the only sound the relentless pounding of the rain. Jeremiah's heart pounded even faster as he fumbled for a flashlight. When he finally managed to turn one on, he saw Daniel still working calmly, his face illuminated by the small beam of light. Then, suddenly, the apartment door burst open again with a violent bang that shattered the fragile quiet. Jeremiah's body tensed. The intruder from earlier seemed to have returned with more force. This time, however, the door did not just rattle. It swung wide open, and a group of shadowy figures filled the doorway. They wore dark clothing and moved with a purpose that left no room for doubt. They were here to take something. Daniel stepped forward, shielding Jeremiah behind him as best he could. "Stay back," Daniel shouted, his voice firm yet calm. The figures did not speak, but one of them stepped forward and pointed a gun at Daniel. The cold metal of the weapon caught the beam of the flashlight, reflecting a harsh glare. Jeremiah's eyes widened in terror. The threat was real and close. The intruders advanced slowly, and one of them barked, "Hand over the drive and the files now, or you both will suffer." Jeremiah clutched the USB drive tightly, feeling its weight in his palm, a small piece of hope in the midst of overwhelming fear. He looked at Daniel, who met his eyes with a silent message, "We must not give in." The room fell silent, the only sounds the pounding rain and the ragged breathing of those in the room. For a moment, time seemed to stretch out, each second filled with the heavy possibility of what might happen next. In that terrifying moment, Jeremiah realized that his fight was not only about saving his father's legacy, it was about exposing a deep, rotten system that had cost too many lives. He had no choice but to stand his ground. With a steady, clear voice that belied his fear, he said, "I will never hand over the evidence. You can try to stop me, but you will never silence the truth." The leader of the intruders sneered. "You think you can defy us, kid? This is bigger than you, and you're in way over your head." Just as the tension reached its peak, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. The intruders exchanged nervous glances. "Time's up," the leader muttered, and with one last threatening look, the group retreated into the stormy night. Jeremiah and Daniel stood frozen, hearts pounding, as the echo of the sirens filled the room. The sudden intrusion had ended as quickly as it began, leaving behind shattered calm and a stark reminder of the dangerous forces arrayed against them. In the aftermath, Jeremiah's resolve hardened even further. He now knew that his every move was being watched, and that the powerful people behind Glendale and Sons would not hesitate to use violence to stop him. Yet, the truth he carried was stronger than any threat. With Daniel's help, he began planning his next move. He would share the evidence with as many trustworthy people as possible, and he would find a way to expose the corruption that had spread its dark roots through the judicial system and the real estate firm. As the night deepened and the storm raged outside, Jeremiah looked out the window at the rain-soaked street. The city lights blurred into streams of color, and he thought of his father's words once more. He felt the weight of his responsibility, but also the fire of determination burning inside him. The threat on his door, the break-ins, and the dark figures had only made his purpose clearer. He whispered to himself, "I will not be silenced. I will fight for justice, for my family, and for everyone who has been wronged." And so, in the quiet after the storm's fury, as the police sirens faded and a heavy silence returned to his apartment, Jeremiah took a deep breath. He picked up his phone and sent encrypted messages to the trusted contacts Thomas had helped him list. He attached copies of the secured files and a short note asking them to be on the lookout for further messages. Each word was typed with careful precision, knowing that the future of his fight rested on these simple acts of courage. The danger was far from over, and the battle had only just begun. But in that moment, Jeremiah felt a surge of hope. He had allies, he had evidence, and most importantly, he had a purpose. The threat of the dark intruders, the violence that had come unbidden into his life, only spurred him to fight harder. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, and the night grew darker. Yet inside his small apartment, a quiet light of determination burned bright. Jeremiah knew that soon, the next move in this dangerous game would come, a move that could change everything. And as the clock ticked toward the early hours of dawn, a new message arrived on his encrypted phone. It was from an unknown sender, and it simply said, "The game has just begun." Jeremiah stared at the message, feeling both fear and resolve. The stakes had grown higher than ever, and the danger was real. With the evidence secure, his friends alerted, and his determination unyielding, he prepared himself for what was coming next. The night had given him many reasons to worry, but it had also shown him that he was not alone. In the silent aftermath of the chaos, with his heart still racing and his mind full of plans, Jeremiah understood that he must now step into the role of a true champion of truth. His father's legacy, the lives affected by the deep corruption he had uncovered, and his own unbreakable spirit drove him forward. In that long, dark night filled with whispered threats and the distant sound of sirens, Jeremiah vowed once again, no matter what extreme dangers lay ahead, he would never back down. The truth, like a spark in the darkness, was waiting to ignite a change that even the most powerful forces could not contain. The message on Jeremiah's phone felt like a whisper from the darkness. The game has just begun. He stared at the glowing screen, his pulse still hammering from the night's events. His door had been kicked in. Armed intruders had demanded the USB drive. And now, someone was taunting him, letting him know that this wasn't over. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He considered responding, but deep down, he knew it was pointless. Whoever sent this wanted him to feel the pressure, to know that they were watching his every move. Jeremiah inhaled slowly. They wanted him scared. They wanted him to run. But he wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, Jeremiah met Thomas at a quiet park on the outskirts of Atlanta. The air was crisp, the trees swaying gently in the wind. Families walked their dogs, joggers passed by, and kids played on the swings. It was the kind of normalcy Jeremiah hadn't felt in weeks. Thomas sat on a bench, a disposable coffee cup in his hand. His usual easygoing smile was gone, replaced by deep worry. When he saw Jeremiah approaching, he stood up. "You okay?" Thomas asked, searching his face. Jeremiah exhaled sharply. "They came to my apartment last night." Thomas's eyes widened. "Who?" "I don't know. A group of them. Armed. They wanted the USB drive." Thomas ran a hand down his face. "Jesus. Jeremiah, this is getting out of control. These people, whoever they are, they're not playing around." Jeremiah nodded, pulling out his phone and showing Thomas the message. This came right after they left. Thomas read it, then clenched his jaw. "They're not just trying to scare you, man. They're warning you." Jeremiah sat down beside him, rubbing his hands together. "I know, but I can't stop now. I made copies of the files. I sent them to a few people I trust. Even if something happens to me, the truth will get out." Thomas shook his head. "That's not enough. You need to go public, Jeremiah. You need to make this so big they can't silence you." Jeremiah looked at him, considering his words. Going public wasn't just risky, it was dangerous. If he exposed the corruption before he had full protection, they would come after him harder than ever. But Thomas was right. If he kept this in the shadows, the people in power would find a way to bury it. Jeremiah leaned back on the bench, staring at the sky. "I need a journalist," he muttered. "Someone big. Someone who won't back down." Thomas's eyes lit up. "I might know just the person." 2 hours later, they sat in a small downtown cafe, waiting. The place was nearly empty. Soft jazz played in the background, the scent of roasted coffee beans thick in the air. Jeremiah's leg bounced under the table as he watched the door. Then she walked in. Rebecca Carter. She was in her late 40s, sharp-eyed and confident. Her dark red blazer was neatly pressed, and she carried a leather notebook under her arm. The moment she spotted them, she headed straight for their table. "Mr. King," she greeted, extending a hand. "Thomas told me you have a story for me." Jeremiah shook her hand firmly. "A big one." Rebecca sat down, setting her notebook on the table. "Tell me everything." Jeremiah took a deep breath and began. He told her about his father's house, about Glendale and Sons, about the rigged cases and the bribery. He told her about the USB drive, the stolen files at the courthouse, and the intruders who had broken into his home. Rebecca listened carefully, her pen gliding across the page as she took notes. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She just wrote. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the table. "This is bigger than I thought," she murmured. "Glendale and Sons isn't just a real estate firm. They've been laundering money for years, bribing judges, acquiring land illegally, forcing people out of their homes. And now, they're trying to silence you." Jeremiah nodded. "That's why I need your help. If this goes public, they won't be able to hide anymore." Rebecca studied him for a long moment. "You understand what this means, right? Once I publish this, you won't be able to go back to a normal life. These people will come at you with everything they have." Jeremiah's jaw tightened. "I don't care. They already came after me. If I don't do this, they'll just keep doing it to others." Rebecca's lips curled into a slight smile. "I like you, Mr. King. You remind me of the kind of people I used to write about before the world got too afraid to stand up." She pulled out a small flash drive from her pocket and slid it across the table. "What's this?" Jeremiah asked. "Insurance," she said. "I've been investigating Glendale and Sons for months. You just gave me the missing piece I needed. Now we take them down." Jeremiah swallowed hard. This was it. No turning back. But just as he reached for the flash drive, The front window of the cafe shattered. A bullet whizzed past Jeremiah's ear, embedding itself into the wall behind him. Chaos erupted. People screamed, diving for cover. Rebecca hit the floor, dragging her notebook with her. Thomas grabbed Jeremiah's arm, yanking him down as another shot rang out. Jeremiah's heart pounded in his chest. Someone was shooting at them. From outside, the screech of tires filled the air. A black SUV peeled away from the curb, disappearing into traffic. Jeremiah's hands shook. They weren't just watching him anymore. They were trying to kill him. Rebecca looked up from behind the overturned table, her eyes blazing. "Well," she muttered, "now we definitely have a story." Jeremiah exhaled shakily. The fear was real, but so was the fire inside him. They wanted him to stop. They wanted him to disappear. But he wasn't going anywhere. The game had just changed. And now, it was his turn to make a move. The shattered glass crunched beneath Jeremiah's boots as he crouched behind the overturned cafe table, his breath coming in sharp gasps. His ears still rang from the gunfire. Around him, customers screamed and scrambled for safety. The cafe owner was shouting into a phone, calling the police. Rebecca Carter pressed herself against the floor, her notebook clutched to her chest. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp and focused. Thomas was shaking. "They just shot at us," he muttered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "They actually tried to kill us." Jeremiah's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was war. Rebecca sat up slowly, brushing glass from her blazer. "We need to move. Now." Jeremiah nodded, scanning the street outside. The black SUV was long gone, but he knew they weren't safe. Whoever was behind this wouldn't stop until until he was gone. The sound of distant sirens grew louder. The police were coming. But Jeremiah knew better than to trust that help was really on the way. Rebecca grabbed her bag and looked at him. "Come with me. Both of you." Jeremiah hesitated. "Where?" "My office. We're going to finish this story, and we're going to do it fast." Thomas shook his head. "Are you crazy? They just shot at us. We should be getting out of town, not running toward danger." Rebecca smirked. "You think running will help? They'll find us wherever we go. The only way to win this is to expose them before they silence us." Jeremiah exhaled. She was right. They had already kicked the hornet's nest. Now, the only way to survive was to burn it down. "Let's go," he said. Rebecca's office was in a rundown building on the edge of downtown. It wasn't fancy, but it was secure. The moment they entered, she locked the doors and pulled the blinds shut. The room smelled of old paper and ink, and every surface was cluttered with files and stacks of newspaper clippings. Rebecca went straight to her desk and pulled out a laptop. "Okay," she said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "First things first. We upload everything." Jeremiah pulled out the USB drive, his fingers tightening around it. He hesitated for only a second before handing it over. Rebecca plugged it in. The files loaded onto the screen, page after page of transactions, payoffs, and court records linking Glendale and Sons to high-ranking judges, law enforcement officials, and politicians. Thomas let out a low whistle. "This is bigger than I thought." Rebecca didn't look up. "It's bigger than all of us." Jeremiah ran a hand over his face. "So what now? We just post it online." Rebecca shook her head. "No. If we just dump the files, they'll call it fake news, cover it up, and spin the story. We need to break this right. Get it in the hands of credible sources before they can control the narrative." She typed rapidly, opening encrypted communication channels. Jeremiah leaned over, watching as she sent pieces of the story to multiple journalists, government watchdogs, and international news agencies. "This way," she explained, "even if something happens to us, the truth will still get out." Jeremiah's stomach clenched at the way she said, "if something happens to us." Before he could respond, a knock sounded at the door. Everyone froze. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Rebecca's eyes met Jeremiah's. "You expecting someone?" Jeremiah shook his head. Thomas swallowed hard. "Maybe it's the police." Rebecca stood and grabbed a baseball bat from behind her desk. "Or maybe it's not." The tension in the room was suffocating. Jeremiah edged toward the door and peered through the peephole. A man in a gray suit stood outside. He wasn't holding a gun, but his posture was rigid, his expression unreadable. Jeremiah took a deep breath and cracked the door open. "Who are you?" The man adjusted his tie. "My name is Agent Wallace. I'm with the FBI." The room fell silent. Jeremiah narrowed his eyes. How do I know that's true? Wallace sighed and pulled out a badge, holding it up. I assume you know what's happening outside, Mr. King. We need to talk. Now. Jeremiah hesitated. He had spent too much time being cautious to blindly trust anyone. But something about the agent's expression, serious, urgent, told him this was real. He stepped aside. Come in. Wallace entered quickly, glancing around. His gaze landed on the laptop, where Rebecca was still encrypting and sending files. Good, he said. That's exactly what you should be doing. Jeremiah folded his arms. What do you want? Wallace exhaled. I've been following the Glendale and Sons investigation for months. We've had suspicions about their operations, but we didn't have enough to take them down. That USB drive. He pointed at the laptop. That's the missing piece. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. If the FBI's been investigating, why haven't you stopped them yet? Wallace hesitated. Because some of the people involved are in our ranks, too. Jeremiah felt a cold chill. You're telling me there are FBI agents protecting these criminals? Wallace nodded grimly. They have people everywhere, judges, police, government officials. They've built an empire. And when empires feel threatened, they strike back. Jeremiah's jaw clenched. They already did. They tried to kill us today. Wallace didn't look surprised. Then you don't have much time. Once Glendale and Sons realizes the files are out, they'll send everything they have to clean up loose ends. That includes you. Thomas rubbed his hands together anxiously. So what do we do? Wallace met Jeremiah's gaze. We make it public. Fast. Rebecca was already ahead of him. She turned her laptop screen toward them. It's done. Jeremiah leaned in. The files were now uploaded to multiple news outlets, encrypted sources, and legal watchdog groups. It was out of their hands now. Wallace exhaled, looking almost relieved. Good. That means it's over. But then, a loud boom shook the building. The walls rattled. The lights flickered. Jeremiah's stomach lurched. Was that? Thomas began, but before he could finish, the entire front window exploded inward. A flashbang grenade rolled across the floor. Get down, Wallace shouted. The grenade erupted in a blinding light. Jeremiah squeezed his eyes shut, his ears ringing as he hit the ground. Voices shouted. Heavy footsteps stormed into the room. Armed men, coming straight for them. Jeremiah hit the floor hard, his ears ringing from the explosion. His vision swam in bright flashes, the world around him a blur of chaos. Shadows moved in the smoke, heavy boots stomping across the floor. They were here. Armed men, dressed in tactical gear, stormed into the office. Their rifles were raised, their movements precise. Jeremiah's instincts kicked in. He rolled behind the desk, gasping for breath, his heart pounding. His fingers fumbled for something, anything, to defend himself with. A hand grabbed his shoulder. He twisted, ready to fight. But it was Agent Wallace. His face was tight with urgency. Stay low, Wallace hissed, drawing his sidearm. They're not cops. They're here to clean house. Jeremiah didn't need to be told twice. Across the room, Rebecca had taken cover behind a filing cabinet, her face pale but determined. Thomas was crouched behind an overturned chair, his hands shaking. One of the gunmen scanned the room through the haze, his voice cutting through the smoke. We want the files. Hand them over, and nobody has to die. Jeremiah's pulse spiked. They didn't know. They didn't know the files were already out. Rebecca's voice came from the shadows. You're too late. The lead gunman turned sharply toward her. What? Rebecca smirked, despite the danger. The files? They're already online. You can't stop this. For the first time, the men hesitated. Then, kill them. The order came, cold and direct. And just like that, the room exploded into gunfire. Wallace fired first, his gun cracking through the air. One of the gunmen stumbled back, his rifle clattering to the floor. Jeremiah dove behind the desk as bullets shredded through the wooden surface, splinters flying past his face. Thomas was still frozen in place. Move, Thomas, Jeremiah yelled, grabbing his arm and yanking him toward cover. Rebecca grabbed her laptop and ducked as another bullet shattered the window behind her. Wallace fired again, but he was outnumbered. The gunmen were closing in fast. Jeremiah's mind raced. They had to get out. Now. The only exit was the back door, but the gunmen were between them and escape. Then he saw it. A fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. An idea sparked. Jeremiah turned to Thomas. When I say run, you run. Thomas gulped. Run where? Anywhere but here. Before Thomas could protest, Jeremiah grabbed the fire extinguisher, ripped it from the wall, and hurled it toward the gunman. It hit the floor hard, the metal casing cracking open. A thick blast of white foam erupted into the air, filling the room in an instant. The gunmen coughed, their vision obscured. "Go!" Jeremiah shouted. Rebecca grabbed her laptop and bolted. Thomas followed, his legs finally moving. Wallace fired one last shot before sprinting after them. They burst through the back door, stumbling into a dark alley. The cold night air hit Jeremiah like a wave. His lungs burned. His ears still rang from the flashbang. Wallace was already pulling out his phone. "We need a car now." Rebecca wasn't stopping. She grabbed Jeremiah's sleeve, dragging him down the alley. "We have to keep moving." Jeremiah knew she was right. The men wouldn't just give up. They had to disappear. Fast. 10 minutes later, they were crammed into a black sedan, speeding down the highway. The city lights blurred past them as Rebecca drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Wallace sat in the passenger seat, speaking into his phone. "We were ambushed. No, I don't know who sent them, but they're professionals." He paused, listening. Then he nodded. "Understood." He hung up and turned to Jeremiah. "You're in the middle of a war now," Wallace said grimly. "They won't stop until you're dead." Jeremiah exhaled. "Yeah, I figured that out when they tried to shoot me." Rebecca glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "We need to go off-grid, at least for a while." Jeremiah frowned. "Where?" Wallace rubbed his temple. "I have a safe house outside the city. No phones, no internet. We lay low until I figure out our next move." Jeremiah shook his head. "No, we can't disappear. We have to finish this." Rebecca sighed. "We already did, Jeremiah. The files are out. The world knows." Jeremiah clenched his jaw. "That's not enough." Wallace narrowed his eyes. "What are you saying?" Jeremiah met his gaze. "I'm saying we don't just expose them." His voice was steady, filled with quiet fury. "We take them down." Silence filled the car. Rebecca blinked. "You want to go after them?" Jeremiah nodded. "Yes. We don't just let the system handle this. We take the fight to Glendale and Sons." Wallace studied him. "That's suicide." Jeremiah's eyes burned with resolve. "Maybe, but I'm done playing defense." Rebecca bit her lip. "You have a plan?" Jeremiah leaned forward. "We don't need to just expose them. We need to cripple them, destroy their operations from the inside. They bribed the courts, the police, everyone. But they still have weaknesses." Wallace looked intrigued. "And what's their biggest weakness?" Jeremiah's expression was cold, calculated. "Money." Rebecca's lips parted in realization. "If we can follow the money," Jeremiah continued, "we can bleed them dry. Shut down their accounts, freeze their assets, expose the people who fund them." Wallace nodded slowly. "That's possible, but risky." Jeremiah smirked. "I don't care about risk anymore." Rebecca exhaled. "Then I guess we just declared war." Jeremiah leaned back, his mind racing. This wasn't about his father's house anymore. It was about justice, about fighting back. And for the first time since this nightmare began, he wasn't just surviving. He was winning. The car sped through the empty highway, the glow of the city fading behind them. The silence inside the vehicle was thick, everyone lost in the weight of what they had just decided. This wasn't about defense anymore. It was war. Rebecca kept her eyes on the road, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. Thomas sat in the back, still shaken from the ambush, his leg bouncing anxiously. Wallace was deep in thought, arms crossed, his gaze locked on the dashboard. Jeremiah, however, was clear-headed. His father had always told him, "The only way to beat a beast is to cut off its legs before it can chase you down." Glendale and Sons had chased him for too long. Now, it was time to take their legs. Wallace finally broke the silence. "You're right," he admitted, his voice even. "Money is their lifeline. If we can shut off their financial supply, they'll collapse." Jeremiah nodded. "We don't need to take down every person they've bribed. Just the flow of cash. If the money stops, the people protecting them will disappear." Rebecca glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "And how exactly do you plan on doing that? These guys don't keep their money in some public checking account. It's hidden, offshore, and protected by layers of security." Jeremiah tapped his fingers on his knee, thinking. "We follow the transactions. Bribery leaves a trail. If we can find the shell companies they're using, we can trace the accounts. Once we have those, we can leak the information to the right people, government agencies, international banks, even the IRS. Wallace exhaled. Easier said than done. But Jeremiah wasn't done yet. There's another way. Wallace raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Jeremiah leaned forward, his voice low. We don't just track their money. We steal it. Rebecca almost swerved the car. Excuse me. Jeremiah's expression was unreadable. Not for ourselves. We take their money and donate it. Charities, legal aid, housing projects. We turn their corruption into something good. And in the process, we cripple them. Wallace rubbed his chin. That could work. But we need a hacker. Someone who can breach their accounts without tipping them off. Rebecca suddenly snapped her fingers. I know a guy. Jeremiah looked at her. Can he be trusted? Rebecca smirked. As much as anyone can trust a hacker. His name is Mason. He's paranoid, lives completely off-grid. But if anyone can break into their system, it's him. Wallace sighed. Then I guess we're going to meet Mason. Rebecca pressed down on the gas. Buckle up. 30 minutes later, they pulled up to an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The place looked abandoned. Rusted metal doors, broken windows, graffiti covering the walls. Jeremiah stepped out first, scanning the area. This where he lives? Rebecca nodded. More like where he works. Mason doesn't do houses. He's convinced the government tracks electricity usage to find hackers. Wallace scoffed. He sounds stable. Rebecca ignored him and walked up to a small metal door. She knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more. A long silence. Then, a voice came through a speaker above the door. Who sent you? Rebecca rolled her eyes. Mason, open the door. It's me. Another pause. Then, the sound of several locks clicking. The metal door creaked open, and a thin man in his early 30s peeked out. His blonde hair was messy, dark circles under his eyes. He wore a hoodie and thick glasses, his fingers twitching slightly as he looked them over. Mason, Rebecca said, we need your help. Mason snorted. You always need my help. She sighed. This time it's big. Mason's eyes flicked to Jeremiah and Wallace. Feds. Wallace held up his hands. Former. Mason grunted. Not better. Rebecca crossed her arms. Are you going to let us in? Or are we going to have this conversation in a dark alley? Mason grumbled something under his breath before stepping aside. Fine. But if you brought a tracking device, I'll know. And I will sell your location to the Russians. Wallace gave him an unimpressed look. Charming. They stepped inside. The warehouse was cluttered with computers, wires, and monitors displaying streams of code. Blue light flickered across the walls. Empty energy drink cans were stacked on a table. Mason plopped into a rolling chair and spun around lazily. All right, what mess are you dragging me into this time? Jeremiah stepped forward. We need access to offshore accounts linked to Glendale and Sons. Mason's eyebrows shot up. You do realize that's, like, international felony-level hacking, right? Jeremiah's stare didn't waver. Can you do it? Mason smirked. Of course I can. Question is, what's in it for me? Rebecca leaned in. Aside from the fact that you'd be helping take down one of the most corrupt organizations in the country? Mason shrugged. Yeah, aside from that. Jeremiah reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black flash drive. This has a list of major corporations Glendale and Sons has laundered money through. Some of them, they're screwing over independent hackers like you, stealing security software, tracking private servers. Mason snatched the flash drive, plugging it into his computer. His fingers flew over the keyboard as he scanned the files. Then he let out a low whistle. Okay, now I'm interested. Jeremiah crossed his arms. Can you do it? Mason grinned. Give me 24 hours. The next night, they were back in the warehouse. Mason's fingers danced over the keyboard. Lines of code filled the screens. All right, he muttered. I found their accounts. Offshore, hidden under fake charities, shell companies. But there's a twist. Jeremiah leaned in. What kind of twist? Mason cracked his knuckles. Glendale and Sons isn't just laundering money. They're paying off law enforcement, politicians, even international banks. This goes way beyond real estate fraud. Wallace's face darkened. How much money are we talking? Mason typed a few more commands, then let out a low whistle. Rough estimate, over $1 billion. The room went silent. Thomas let out a nervous laugh. We're not just fighting a company. We're fighting an empire. Rebecca took a deep breath. So what do we do with it? Jeremiah stared at the screens, his mind racing. Then, his lips curled into a determined smirk. We take it. All of it. Mason laughed. You're insane. Jeremiah didn't blink. Can you do it? Mason sighed dramatically, then cracked his knuckles. Hell yes, I can. Rebecca grinned. Then let's burn them to the ground. As the warehouse filled with the hum of computers and the glow of flickering screens, Jeremiah knew. This wasn't just about his father's house anymore. They were about to cripple an empire. The air in the warehouse was thick with tension. The glow of computer screens reflected off Jeremiah's face as Mason's fingers flew over the keyboard, executing a cyber heist that would shake the foundations of power itself. Lines of code blurred across the screen. Numbers shifted, transactions rerouted, offshore accounts drained. Glendale and Sons had built their empire on stolen wealth. Tonight, they were going to lose it all. Mason let out a low whistle. All right, folks. We are officially inside their system. Jeremiah leaned in. How much can we take? Mason grinned. Better question, how much do you want to take? Wallace crossed his arms. All of it. Mason chuckled. Now that's what I like to hear. He typed a few more commands, then cracked his knuckles. They've got accounts spread across 6 countries. Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, Hong Kong, you name it. They've been hiding money under fake charities, real estate developments, even church donations. Rebecca shook her head. Unbelievable. Mason pointed to the screen. The good news? They got lazy. Some of these shell companies are linked directly to their main bank accounts. That means I can reroute the funds before they even notice. Jeremiah's eyes narrowed. Where's it going? Mason smirked. Everywhere. Homeless shelters, legal defense funds, community housing projects. By the time Glendale and Sons realize what happened, their money will be funding the very people they've been screwing over for decades. Thomas let out a nervous laugh. We're about to rob the rich and give to the poor. Mason wiggled his fingers dramatically. Call me Robin Hood. Jeremiah felt his heart pounding, but this time it wasn't fear. It was adrenaline. They were about to do something impossible. Something that would send a message to every corrupt official, every greedy businessman who thought they could manipulate the system. Tonight, the tables were turning. Mason cracked his neck. All right, folks, time to press the big red button. He hovered his finger over the keyboard. Jeremiah took a deep breath. Do it. Mason pressed enter. The system flickered. The numbers on the screen began to shift. One by one, accounts emptied. The offshore banking networks lit up as billions of dollars flowed out like a dam breaking. Then, an alarm blared. Mason's eyes widened. Oh, crap. Rebecca spun around. What is it? Mason's fingers flew across the keys. Someone's trying to block the transfer. Their system detected the breach. Wallace swore under his breath. Can you override it? Mason gritted his teeth. I can, but whoever's on the other side isn't just some low-level IT guy. They're good. Really good. The screens flashed red. A message popped up in bold letters. Access denied. Transaction blocked. Then another message appeared. Whoever you are, you just made a very big mistake. Jeremiah felt a chill run down his spine. They know. Mason cursed. Not just know. They're fighting back. They're trying to trace us. Wallace grabbed his gun. We need to move. Now. Mason slammed his fists on the keyboard. I just need a few more seconds. Another alarm blared. Then, the power went out. The warehouse plunged into darkness. The only sound was the distant hum of servers cooling down and Mason muttering, "Oh, this is very, very bad." Rebecca pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight. The small beam cut through the darkness. Mason, talk to me. Mason's fingers moved across the keyboard blindly. They just hit us with a cyber attack. They shut off our access, but, he suddenly grinned. They were too late. Jeremiah's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Mason leaned back smugly. I managed to reroute 70% of their funds before they stopped us. Wallace let out a low whistle. We just stole hundreds of millions of dollars. Rebecca smirked. Correction. We just donated hundreds of millions of dollars. Mason's grin faded. Yeah, but now they're pissed. And if I had to guess, the distant sound of screeching tires filled the air. Jeremiah's stomach dropped. They're coming. The first SUV skidded to a stop outside the warehouse, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Then another. Then another. Black vehicles, tinted windows, no license plates. Armed men poured out, dressed in tactical gear. Jeremiah grabbed Mason by the arm. Is there another way out? Mason swallowed hard. There's a back door, but... Move. Wallace barked. They sprinted toward the back of the warehouse just as the first gunshot rang out. Bullets shattered the windows. Thomas yelped and ducked behind a desk. "Oh my God, they're trying to kill us." Rebecca pulled him up. "Keep moving." Wallace fired a few rounds toward the entrance, buying them time. Mason threw open the back door, revealing a dark alley. "This way." They bolted into the alley, the cold night air hitting them like a wall. Behind them, the gunmen poured into the warehouse. Jeremiah knew they only had seconds before the men realized they were gone. They needed to disappear. Rebecca pointed to a nearby sewer grate. "There." Jeremiah hesitated. "You want us to go into the sewer?" Rebecca shrugged. "Would you rather get shot?" "Fair point." Mason pried the grate open, and one by one, they climbed down into the darkness below. Jeremiah was the last to go. He grabbed the edge of the grate and pulled it shut just as a flashlight beam swept over the alley. He held his breath. The sound of boots approached. A gruff voice muttered, "They were just here." Another voice cursed, "Find them. Now." Footsteps retreated. In the silence of the sewer, Jeremiah exhaled slowly. They had escaped. For now. Half an hour later, they emerged in a rundown part of the city, soaked in sweat and covered in grime. Thomas bent over, gasping. "That was the worst experience of my life." Mason smirked. I've had worse." Rebecca ignored them and pulled out her phone. She tapped the screen, then smiled. "It's everywhere," she said. "The money's gone. The files are viral. News stations are already reporting it." Wallace nodded in approval. "Glendale and Sons is finished." Jeremiah wiped sweat from his forehead. They had won. But deep down he knew this wasn't over. Because somewhere, in a high-rise office, the real mastermind behind Glendale and Sons was watching and planning his next move. The world was on fire. News channels across the country were running one story: Glendale and Sons exposed in massive corruption scandal. The headlines were brutal. Billion-dollar real estate fraud uncovered. Judges, police, and politicians implicated. Anonymous hackers drain corrupt corporations' offshore accounts. Glendale and Sons CEO in hiding as arrest warrants issued. Videos of angry homeowners, displaced families, and whistleblowers flooded the internet. Protests erupted outside Glendale and Sons headquarters. Law enforcement agencies, real ones, not the ones Glendale had bought, were raiding corporate offices, seizing records, arresting executives. The empire had fallen, and Jeremiah King had started it all. He sat in a dimly lit motel room, watching the news play out on the tiny TV screen. The others were scattered around the room. Rebecca on her laptop, checking updates. Wallace standing by the door, phone in hand. Mason on the bed, chewing on a protein bar like this was just another day. Thomas paced. "So what now?" No one answered right away. Because even though Glendale and Sons was going up in flames, they all knew the real fight wasn't over. Jeremiah leaned forward, rubbing his hands together. "Who's behind it?" Rebecca glanced up. "What do you mean?" Jeremiah pointed at the screen. "The CEO is missing. The company is burning, but the people running it, the real people, are still out there." Wallace nodded. Glendale and Sons was just a piece of something bigger. They were the public face, but someone else was pulling the strings. Rebecca sighed. "We've been too busy fighting the soldiers. We haven't gone after the general." Mason let out a low whistle. "And let me guess, you want to keep going?" Jeremiah didn't hesitate. "Yeah, I do." Thomas groaned. "Dude, we just took down $1 billion empire. Can we, I don't know, take a day off?" Jeremiah exhaled. "We took out the headquarters. But the people who funded this? The people who made Glendale and Sons possible? They're still out there." Rebecca tapped her laptop, scrolling. "Well, if you want to know where the real power is, we need to follow what's left of their money." Mason sat up. "Say no more." He grabbed his laptop and started typing. "I got access to some of their financial logs before they kicked me out. Most of their offshore accounts were drained. But there's a final transfer that went through just before we hit them." Jeremiah frowned. "Where?" Mason's fingers moved rapidly. His eyes widened. Oh man." Everyone leaned in. Wallace narrowed his eyes. "Where did the money go?" Mason gulped. "Not where." "Who?" He turned the screen toward them. A name flashed across the monitor. "Richard Langston." Silence filled the room. Rebecca cursed. "Of course." Jeremiah clenched his fists. Richard Langston, the powerful businessman who had warned him back in the courtroom. The man who acted like he was above it all. The man who had given him the USB drive in the first place. Wallace exhaled. So that's how they operate. Langston wasn't a bystander in all this. He's the cleanup crew. Mason nodded. Yeah. And guess what? He just transferred the last of Glendale and Sons' remaining money into a private bank account. Jeremiah's jaw tightened. He's moving the money. Trying to start over. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. So what do? We already exposed the company. Do we really have enough to go after him? Mason grinned. Well, we could always make things personal. Jeremiah smirked. What do you mean? Mason cracked his knuckles. Langston's rich, powerful, and careful. But even guys like him have weak spots. He pulled up another file and turned the screen toward Jeremiah. It was a home address. Rebecca blinked. Wait, is that? Mason nodded. Richard Langston's private estate. Just outside the city. Silence. Then Wallace spoke. You want to go to his house? Mason shrugged. I mean, technically, I was just going to leak the address. Let the public do their thing. But Jeremiah had a different idea. He stood up, grabbing his jacket. No, his voice was firm. I want to talk to him. Rebecca's eyes widened. Jeremiah, that's insane. If Langston's behind this, do you really think he's just going to admit it? Jeremiah's jaw clenched. I don't need him to admit it. He pulled the USB drive from his pocket, the one Langston had given him weeks ago. I just need to make sure he knows. Jeremiah's voice dropped into something darker, more dangerous. That this isn't over. Wallace exhaled. Then let's go pay Langston a visit. An hour later, they arrived at the massive Langston estate. It was a fortress, tall iron gates, security cameras, expensive cars in the driveway. The house was sleek and modern, its glass windows glowing in the night. Mason muttered, rich people, man. Rebecca rolled her eyes. So what's the plan? Just knock on the door? Jeremiah stepped forward. Yeah. Wallace grabbed his arm. Jeremiah, be smart. Langston doesn't just run companies like Glendale and Sons. He runs men. Dangerous ones. Jeremiah pulled free. Then let's see if he's brave enough to face me alone. Before anyone could stop him, Jeremiah walked up to the gate and pressed the intercom button. A moment later, a cold, familiar voice answered. Jeremiah King. I was wondering when you'd show up. Jeremiah's pulse quickened. Langston had been expecting him. The gate slowly opened. Wallace's hand hovered near his gun. Rebecca and Thomas exchanged nervous glances. Jeremiah took a deep breath. Then, without fear, he stepped inside. The fight wasn't over. Glendale and Sons was gone. But Richard Langston? He was still standing. For now. But Jeremiah King had one last message for him. And this time, it would be the end. Jeremiah King walked through the iron gates of the Langston estate, his steps steady, his heartbeat calm. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and something else, something invisible but heavy. Power. The kind of power that came from owning people, from controlling the game. Tonight, Jeremiah had come to end it. Inside the house, Richard Langston sat in a sleek leather chair, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He didn't look surprised to see Jeremiah standing in his living room. In fact, he smiled. Mr. King, Langston said smoothly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. I was wondering when you'd show up. Jeremiah didn't waste time. You set this all up, he said. His voice was steady, but it carried the weight of everything he had been through. Glendale and Sons. The bribery. The corruption. You were never just watching. You were running it. Langston smirked. You're a smart man. I won't insult you by denying it. Jeremiah clenched his fists. Then why give me the USB drive? Why let me take down Glendale and Sons if you were behind it all? Langston leaned back, completely unfazed. Because they were sloppy. They outlived their usefulness. You were a convenient tool to wipe them off the board. Jeremiah's jaw tightened. You used me. Langston shrugged. And you did exactly what I wanted. Silence. Then, Jeremiah pulled out his phone. He turned the screen toward Langston. A live video feed was streaming. News stations. Investigators. Government watchdogs. Jeremiah's voice was calm, but lethal. You're live, Langston. Everything you just admitted? The world heard it. Langston's smirk vanished. For the first time, the man who had controlled everything looked shaken. Jeremiah stepped closer. You thought I was just some pawn in your game. He smiled coldly. You thought wrong. Langston shot up from his chair, his face red with fury. You don't know what you've done. Jeremiah met his glare, unflinching. Yeah, I do. I just ended you. Outside, sirens wailed. The FBI was here. Langston's empire, his power, his connections, everything, was about to collapse. Jeremiah turned to leave. Just before he reached the door, he glanced back. Langston stood there, frozen, defeated. For the first time, Jeremiah saw something in his eyes. Fear. And just like that, it was over. 1 month later, the world had changed. Glendale and Sons was gone. Richard Langston was arrested. Judges, politicians, and dirty cops were being exposed. And Jeremiah King? He stood on the porch of his father's house. The same house they had tried to steal. The same house he had fought for. He ran his hand over the wooden railing, the familiar warmth of home grounding him. Thomas, Rebecca, and Wallace sat on the steps, watching the sunset. You really did it, Thomas said, shaking his head in disbelief. Rebecca smirked. Not bad for a guy with no law degree. Wallace exhaled. The system is still broken. There will be more like Langston. Jeremiah nodded. Then we'll take them down too. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. So this isn't the end? Jeremiah smiled. This is just the beginning. The sun dipped below the horizon. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, justice had won.